Okay. Good morning, everyone. We'll give another minute just for people to join, and then we will kick things off. Okay. We're going to get started here. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Another installment of ConservAmerica's webinar series. I'm Jeff Kupfer, the president of our organization. As we do this webinar, COP28 is taking place in the United Arab Emirates. Reports are that there are over 70,000 people there. Not sure what they all will be doing while they are there, but we are being much more efficient with our time and with our carbon emissions, and spending the next 45 minutes or so discussing the important topic of decarbonization in the freight and transportation sector. We thought it was important to host this conversation for a few reasons. First, much of the public attention has been on changes in the transportation sector for passenger vehicles. What's happening with electric vehicle infrastructure, how will auto companies adjust their production, where minerals will come from, and not as much on freight. And second, freight is unquestionably exceedingly important in considering environmental and climate impacts. Projections show that between 2020 and 2050, U.S. freight activity will grow by 50% in tonnage. The International Energy Agency also estimates that oil demand from trucking alone will grow by 25% by 2040. So to help us unpack what that means, the challenges, the technologies, the policies that can have an impact, we have two great panelists. I'm going to let them provide more of their background in a minute, but just to set the stage, we have Drew Pierce, former Deputy Administrator of the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which is a mouthful, called PHMSA, at the U.S. Department of Transportation, and Lauren Smith, former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy, also at the Transportation Department. Before we start, just want to say a word about our organization. ConservAmerica is a nonprofit dedicated to developing and promoting market-based solutions to our energy, environmental, and conservation challenges. We've been around for a few decades, and in the last few years, we've really reinvigorated ourselves to drive policy debates towards more meaningful and impactful solutions. We've also weighed in on the issue of freight transportation a few times in the past. Last year in 2022, for instance, we joined other organizations, including the National Wildlife Federation, Third Way, and C3 in a letter to the Surface Transportation Board, urging caution when considering new regulations that could impact how railroads operate, including a proposed rule to mandate reciprocal switching. We were concerned that remain concerned that excessive regulations would push freight to more carbon-intensive modes of transportation. We've also written to the Federal Railroad Administration, urging them to focus on the unintended environmental consequences of certain labor rules, such as minimum crew size. Okay, let's get to the experts. We'll start with Drew. Drew, it would be great if you could introduce yourself, as you have a very varied, impressive background in this sector, and also tell us what PHMSA, the great acronym, actually does.
Okay, I'll be happy to. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this webinar today. I am an Alaskan. That's a state where some of our freight still moves by either stow machine or even by dog sled. So the intermodal capacity up there is quite interesting. My career in government started in Alaska. I was elected to the state legislature and spent 17 years serving including 9 in leadership on the Senate side, and I was twice Senate president. I actually resigned my Senate seat to come to DC in 2001 to join the George W. Bush administration, working at the Department of Interior, where I was the Secretary's senior advisor for Alaska. And then I became the federal coordinator for the Alaska Gas Transportation Systems when we thought we were going to commercialize our North Slope gas and bring it down a pipeline tying into Canada and to the lower 48. But that was before the shale gas revolution, and the Alaska gas, unfortunately, was pushed out of the markets by the cheaper and closer domestic gas in the lower 48. When I left the administration in 2010, I joined a law firm and that had offices in both Alaska and here in DC, and work with primarily Alaska clients, trying to figure out how to do business in Alaska, but also how to parse the regulatory and permitting challenges that they face trying to do business in Alaska. When President Trump was elected, I went back into government and became the deputy administrator at PHMSA. As you said, that's the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, where I spent my time both overseeing the regulatory side, the rulemaking side, but also ensuring through the work that that PHMSA does, ensuring that transportation is as safe as possible. Safety is key, and that was our number one challenge, but also our top priority each and every day.
Great. Thanks, Drew. And Lauren, you also have a very impressive background. May not go back as far as Drew's, but it would be great to hear it and also tell us about what you're currently doing.
Not as much adventure in the last frontier, yeah, as Drew, that's for sure. I was actually born in Washington D.C. and I've spent my entire adult professional life here in the DC area, in and out of government the last little over 20 years, including 5 years as a congressional staffer. I worked at the U.S. Department of Labor. And then most recently, I did work with Drew as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Transportation. So, and in that role, I worked on energy and environment issues, accessibility, trucking, supersonic aviation, and all sorts of fun different things. It was a wonderful experience. I was also the Chief Environmental Review Permitting Officer for the department. That was a great honor and a great experience. Most recently, I run a research and strategic consulting firm called Skyline Policy Risk Group, and I am also a member of Baylor University's Supply Chain Advisory Board. So all very exciting, and I love talking about supply chain policy.
Okay, great. And so we're going to jump right into it. I will tell any of our attendees that if you have questions, I believe the chat is working, and feel free to send them to me or to us, and we'll try and cover them. And also, we're going to try and do a lot of back and forth here as well. So I'll encourage our panelists to engage with each other as well. I'm going to just kind of throw out a big picture question, which is as we all sort of step back and think about reducing emissions in the freight transportation sector here in the U.S. What are the biggest challenges to doing so? And also, if you could give us some sense of the scale of emissions in some of the various modes, I think that would be helpful in trying to set a baseline as well. Drew, do you want to kick it off?
In terms of scale, one of the things that many people don't think about or don't recognize unless they're looking at a truck with a diesel engine is the fact that not only do you have GHG emissions, but you also have black carbon emissions, particularly in the trucking industry and in rail to a degree. That's a pollutant that is also very troublesome. We particularly see it in the Arctic, affecting our air and affecting our climate. So that's one of the things that is often not talked about in terms of emission reduction. There are a number of challenges to reduction, no matter which mode of transportation you're using. But in particular, for the trucking industry, differing modes and changing the technology is oftentimes expensive, both for the truck itself, but also then for the ongoing operating costs. And so the new technology needs to continue to develop until it is efficient and effective in terms of its cost effectiveness for the industry, or we're going to see prices driven up for all the commodities that are transported by the industry. That's true on the rail side also, where we will probably see hydrogen trains in the future. That technology also has to mature and become very much less expensive before it's going to be practicable for ongoing use.
Okay, and we're going to come back and talk about specifically about some of the new technologies that are out there, what's kind of on the horizon. Lauren, what's your take on the big challenges right now?
Well, it's fundamentally cost. It's really all about cost. So if you go to the dictionary, the definition of the word technology is usually given as using scientific knowledge for machinery applied through scientific knowledge. But I think that's even a little bit too downstream of what the core meaning of technology is. Technology is fundamentally the art of doing more with less. And applied to transportation and applied to this discussion about decarbonizing the transportation sector, it's about how do you get technology to create new ways of doing things that are going to be cheaper, more affordable, more efficient for industry, more affordable for regular people, whether it's driving cars or just ordering from Amazon and having the cost of the transportation built into the price. This is the challenge, and this is the main thing that both industry and policymakers need to keep in mind is unless you're working on bringing that cost down, you're not making forward progress, and that's the challenge. I don't say that as a doom and gloom pessimist. I say like no, we're focusing on the core issue, and we will get through the core issue, and then we will be in a better place because we've really only begun, I think, to tap over the past few hundred years with the energy industry, and now going forward to the next several hundred years of the energy industry. What are going to be the technological breakthroughs that will allow us to do more with the transportation sector and increase mobility? And so keeping focused on that is critical. I think about supply chain as sort of supply chain is a term that itself could use some unpacking. Basically it's how do we get our freight from point A to point B, improving infrastructure. There's that's a challenge because of our permitting system, which in the US is actually more complicated and cumbersome than even in other developed countries. Regulatory policy that sort of helps promote technological advancement and innovation by companies to move in this direction. And then, we also have to think about, our trade policies around the world, geopolitics. If we don't have, strong geopolitical outreach from the US, it's going to be very difficult to get the supply chain going for a lot of the critical minerals that we're going to need to evolve the transportation sector in the direction that people would like to see it going.
Well, why don't we talk a little bit about some of the technologies that are on the horizon in the transportation sector that will help with more efficient movement and decarbonization, and then we can circle back and talk about some of the challenges with those technologies. But what do you all look at and see both in the relatively short term and then medium and longer term.
So one of the things that I'd like to add to what Lauren just said that leads into that is the fact that we do need to look at moving freight in terms of which modes it's moving on, if possible. In terms of safety of transportation, anything that you can put in a pipeline and move from point A to point B, that's the safest mode of transportation. Marine is second, rail. Trucks are the least safe in terms of the number of accidents, but also the capacity of our highway systems. As Lauren just said, we need massive increases in infrastructure to be able to handle the sort of freight that you were talking about we're going to see. So making some changes in which modes, moving more to the marine side would be very efficient, moving more to pipelines if possible, or moving just more to rail. But rail is also overcrowded these days. So that becomes difficult. So looking at technologies, just not only the fuel for all of these modes, as well as new technologies for actually making it happen. How do you get more marine transportation on our waterways? That's also an important side to the technology question.
Good. Lauren?
Well, I some of the specific things. I think that the railroads are incredibly important for our freight sector. They move about 30% of all of the freight that's moved in the U.S. Trucks are incredibly important. Everything you eat and everything you wear got there on a truck, whether it was at the supermarket where you bought food, or whether it's the Amazon truck delivering, whatever you bought to your house. Unless you grew it in your backyard, it got there on a truck. I think while there can be secular shifts over time between the different modes of freight, the intermodal universe alone between trucking and trains is so massive that I think if you're working for one of the big players in either the rail sector or the truck sector, you would like to try to peel off tactically certain contracts or shipments or way that you ship different things. Yes, rail has incredible efficiencies associated with it, but we're not going to use trains for all of our truck freight. And pipelines are have fantastic efficiencies of their own, but you can't get pipelines everywhere. In fact, putting down new pipe is an astoundingly difficult part of our permitting universe. So I think that I look within each mode to what are the technologies being used within each mode, rather than expecting dramatic shifts. Again, there will be shifts over time between modes, but I wouldn't say that the modes are they exist in an uneasy partnership and they like to take from each other from time to time. But I don't really think about them as really being competitors in the direct sense of being at war with each other.
So you referenced the 30%, and I think in one of our blog posts we noted that more than 1/3 of U.S. freight measured by tonnage traveled on railroads, and yet the railroads contribute less than 1% of total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions and 1.9% of transportation related emissions. So when you look at it that way, rail clearly has some emissions benefits. But it sounds like what I hear you saying is you don't see a kind of large shift from one source of transportation to another. Maybe what one should be looking at is how to make each one of those modes more efficient in a whole variety of different ways.
Yeah, they do different things. You're absolutely right. Trains are fantastic. Look, I read the Atlas Shrugged. That's great. Trains are great. But again, trucks do things and they go places. It's the arteries and the veins and the capillaries in your body, and you're like, man, this artery is so efficient. This is awesome. why don't we just have the artery take everything to the tips of your fingers? Like, well, that would be tough. So I mean, they do different things. Yes, I think over time, I think, you know, as the rail system gets more efficient, you know, it will be possible to shift some of the freight onto there. But if you just take, you know, those two, you know, stats, like, well, they use this much amount of freight, but they're doing this amount of emissions. Why don't we do more? I mean, yes, there can be some incremental changes there, but the trucking sector is huge and massive and does lots of very important things. Again, you know, in a sense of being more like the capillaries. I think when you think about some of those, a lot of the big freight, the large container shipping, you know, some of that, you know, there can be some shifts over time, but I think it would be a mistake to focus too much on that. I mean, I think that there's, you know, again, pipelines have great efficiencies. Maritime, Drew brought up, have great efficiencies. And so we definitely should look to move things in a more economical and efficient direction. And there will be, I think, environmental benefits to that as well.
Okay.
And it's important to look at where are the bottlenecks and how do we fix them? And a lot of that is the infrastructure. And great example nearby is the over 100-year-old tunnel in Baltimore, the rail tunnel, that doesn't allow for double container transportation. So it's a huge bottleneck up and down the East Coast. Rail can move with double containers on either side, but can't get through Baltimore. So that is undergoing, a new tunnel is being built, or that one's being expanded. And that project is going to take some time, but permitting it and then figuring out how to pay for it took a number of years. So it's a project that needed to happen. It takes a long time to make those huge infrastructure projects happen. And looking at where the bottlenecks are and trying to fix those things is the sort of thing that Lauren's shop did at DOT and helped to prioritize across the country. What do we need to do to help make the system more efficient? And that brings the costs down, of course.
Yeah, and just sticking on the infrastructure issue for a second. I mean, have you seen that as a country we've made improvements in terms of dealing with infrastructure issues, and once we decide to deal with it and actually making it happen? And have there been significant changes among different administrations in terms of the policies that may encourage that, or are some of these just baked into the cake and, you know, not going to change a whole lot?
Frankly, permitting is getting more difficult, not less. And so major transportation projects, no matter what they are and no matter where they are, whether it's an airport, whether it's a port, whether it's a new lane for highways, whatever it might be, it's very difficult to permit anywhere in the country, frankly. Places you would expect to welcome new transportation projects, you find people who are opposed, and it's just becoming more difficult and more costly. So no, I have not seen. I mean, we do see we do see projects that finally happen that are certainly very helpful, but the number of them versus the number that need to happen to help make the system more efficient and effective is somewhat minuscule.
Good. Lauren, you have played a significant role in permitting issues. You agree with that assessment?
In part. So I think the growth of bureaucracy has been a challenge. The growth of development, I mean, you have more people, it gets more complicated. You know, people own the land. They're not going to give up the land. The land, you know, increases in value. And then a government or a company looking to build a project has to come up with the money to, whether eminent domain is being used or not. At some level, you know, you have to exchange cash for land if you're going to build an infrastructure project. And so that does become more challenging. But from a policy side, I would say, you know, I would say, you know, things are very incrementally improving. And in some sense, maybe just because I think we have a little bit more of a sense of what should happen. When Drew and I were working at the Department of Transportation, one of the policies that we both had a touch on was the one federal decision executive order, which essentially ordered agencies to work together on specific projects. So if you had a project where the Department of Agriculture, the Department of the Interior, EPA, the Department of Transportation all had jurisdiction over the project under this executive order, under one federal decision, one of the agencies would be designated as the lead agency, and the other agencies that had jurisdiction would be cooperating agencies. And so that one agency would have a centralized decision-making process. So you could march through the steps, but it would be, but the other agencies wouldn't come in at the very end and say, well, now we're going to do our 24-month review, which, kills you and pushes you out a decade, huge problem. So that's one federal decision. That executive order was reversed 2.5 years ago. But then when the infrastructure bill was signed into law in November 2021, Congress did put in a version of one federal decision into the infrastructure law. Unfortunately, it was a fairly toothless version of it. It only applied to DOT projects, and it was voluntary for other agencies. And if it's voluntary, they're not going to do it because different agencies are, any agency is very turf conscious with its jurisdiction. So without more sort of muscle behind that, you're not going to see any change there. But there is a conceptual framework for having a structure that does streamline the process a little bit by saying one federal agency is in charge. Now, you also have state level agencies and even local governments that get involved in big infrastructure projects. And so, something eventually has to be worked out there. One of the challenges with the American permitting system that makes it more challenging, and again, every developed country has the same, sort of general issue. And I think Drew's right, that's getting harder, probably will continue to get harder in many ways. But where we can make some improvements is by maybe reducing the number of checkpoints. If you have a very large infrastructure project, it's appropriate for there to be half a dozen different decision points where you're going through the siting, the research, the approvals, the fundraising for a project, but maybe not 35 checkpoints like we have now. And so I think to the extent that you can combine some of those things, and this is a similar concept to one federal decision, is like maybe let's just centralize it a little bit more than where it is now. We don't want to go all the way to the far side where basically one person gets to make the decision from start to finish. That would be too far. But we want to try to get back to more sort of in the middle. And I guess I would say, Drew's right. Things are bad. Things are not particularly improving. But I think that, we have at least a roadmap with one federal decision. We have a roadmap with some of the things that we understand can be done. The 2021 IIJA, the infrastructure bill. Okay, so it was a toothless version of one federal decision, but at least that is a provision in the law that we can build on when the next, probably 2027, when the next infrastructure bill comes in. Let's increase that provision so we can make it a little bit easier to build some of these projects. And I think in the debt ceiling agreement over the summer, there was some energy infrastructure policy in there that could be useful to build on. They basically did the Mountain Valley pipeline to sort of checkbox right there, and that was a little bit of a one-off. But at least there was some interest in doing that, and I think you're seeing more bipartisan interest, especially because there's a lot of renewable projects that a lot of Democrats favor, and they're getting caught up in the permitting net now. And so I think you may see sort of across, a bipartisan approach, or at least incentives, right? You see an incentive structure for Washington to maybe think about inching forward on these things.
Yeah, and that's something we've been trying to get in, where we are involved in as an organization, and remain hopeful that something will happen at some point, even though also being realistic about the difficulties of getting something additional passed. And so, go ahead, Drew.
Congress continues to look at permit reform, and I think Lauren's right that we are seeing a more bipartisan approach. Alaska's Senator Murkowski, who is known for being an advocate, certainly of energy projects and other projects, has talked about the fact that her colleagues from across the aisle have come to her in the past year and said, we need to do something about permit reform. We need to build transmission lines and we can't get them built. And it's like the light finally went on that it's not just building a pipeline, but it's how do you get energy from a solar array to the consumers? You need transmission lines. And so we're seeing exactly what Lauren's talking about, that bipartisan approach. And I think we'll see more reform as Congress moves forward. And I think Mountain Valley was one of the first and had a lot of strong advocates and a lot of strong naysayers. But it happened. And I think the success of that is going to push others to look at their projects and come up with new ways to write creative laws that can help make those projects happen. So I think we will see more permit reform, which is great.
Yep. It's sort of related to permit reform, but in the same kind of government regulatory space. Are there kind of non-permitting regulatory issues, or sort of over-regulation, as we may say, in the transportation sector that are potentially hindering or could impact the drive to decarbonize? I mean, we've flagged a few over time related to rail, but I'm just sort of wondering what you all think about those, or maybe some others that we should be paying attention to.
Sure.
Go ahead. Either way.
I'm thinking certainly the country's strategy for accessing the strategic and critical minerals that we need to make a transition to green energy, and certainly to make the transition to a greener transportation system is difficult at the moment. First of all, you need to have the exploration and then the development. It takes mining. And many people are not in favor of mining certainly not in their backyard, but there are a number of NGOs that are not in favor of any mining anywhere in the United States. But we're going to depend upon the accessing those minerals to be able to make the transition. So we have to figure out the rest of the world, while certainly willing to be part of the supply chain that brings those minerals into the United States. Many countries are saying, well, you can't just push all the mining into our country. You need to do some at home. So that's the sort of policy discussion that we need to have as a nation, frankly, because it is very difficult to permit a mine in the United States these days to try to have access to the minerals that we need. Lithium, cobalt, even copper, all of those things that we certainly need for the transition of the trucking industry as we move to greener transitions and greener technologies.
Right. Lauren, what's your take on some of the potential over-regulation in the sector?
Sure. Well, I think that the permitting, as Drew said, it's sort of it's a regulatory and a permitting issue with mines. You've got to figure out what are the safe ways of accessing the natural resources. We have a lot of lithium deposits in the U.S. This may be another technology issue where we need technology to be able to tap into these resources safely. We need to make sure that we're not outrunning what the technology currently supports. The EPA has a structure for this, the MACT structure, maximum available control technology, and then the way that's defined, I think is a matter of some debate. I think that the how we approach the trucking sector is something that needs a lot of thought too. I mean, what are electric vehicle trucks still have a lot of challenges associated with them. You've got to be able to pull a heavy load. You've got to be able to operate in cold weather. These are real challenges. How are we going to think about hydrogen trucks and hydrogen transport, setting up hydrogen? That's an area where regulation, really needs to be thought through. There are the many different colors of hydrogen. Green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, gray, pink, orange. It's actually kind of an amazing array of colors. Just in terms of the designations for how green the production of hydrogen is. I think it's very intriguing. It helps that hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, but producing it is another matter. Controlling it. So I think a lot of those environmental regulations, have to be written, with the available technology in mind. And again, cost. I mean, the driving those costs down has got to be a top priority, and policymakers have to think about that. And this goes for labor, health, safety regulations as well. That we need a regulatory network in place covering various elements of the policy world, but prioritizing efficiency for the freight sector has got to be, needs to be right there at the forefront, top of mind. You've got to have that mobility, otherwise things move in the wrong direction, and then you end up with less green results.
All right. It's also the cost impact is difficult. Lauren talks about electric trucking and electric trucks. The cost of the truck itself is much more expensive for your tractor than a gas or diesel powered truck, and the margins in the industry are fairly small. So it becomes problematic for the individual trucker or for the company to try to make a transition like that when it's going to be so expensive. And are we going to subsidize those costs? That's a policy decision that has to be made. So these transitions, as Lauren said, we've got to think through the policy and think through the regulatory process and make sure that we're not setting policies that are both far ahead of the regulatory process, as well as far ahead of the interest of the industry in making the change and figuring out how to afford the change because of the cost. So PHMSA, for example, right now is just entering into discussions that will eventually lead to regulations for transporting hydrogen by pipelines, but all the different colors, all the different phases. There are lots of questions about whether your design and your integrity of your pipe needs to be different depending upon which phase, which color of hydrogen you're talking about moving from point A to point B. So there are many, many questions to be answered before we just make this huge leap into the hydrogen world.
Drew, and is that a technical safety discussion about whether those different types of hydrogen will have different impacts on the pipeline, or is it more about, hey, we prefer this type of hydrogen because there's less, because it's created by renewable power instead of natural gas, and therefore we're getting more incentives.
So for a PHMSA, the safety regulatory agency, it will not be a choice of which type of hydrogen. That will be a policy decision or perhaps a cost decision down the road. What PHMSA will be doing is looking at the different kinds of hydrogen and deciding what should the minimum standards be for building a pipe or a rail car or whichever mode you're going to use, or a truck tank. What are the standards that should be set for that transportation, whether it's by truck, whether it's by rail, whether it's by pipeline. And so they'll set the safety standards.
Got it. Okay. We're hitting the last few minutes here, so I just want to tee up a couple things. The question of environmental benefits versus safety and everything else. Drew, I know you've been involved in LNG transport and some of the rules that are going into that. So can you spend a minute or so just talking about that?
Well, LNG is one of the cleanest bridge fuels, of course, that we have. The country is exporting LNG massive quantities, but also utilizing it here in the United States. PHMSA worked on regulations that would allow an expanded use of rail to transport LNG by rail car. A lot of research went into that, including a new design for a rail car that was designed to be the safest car for the transport of LNG. And in 2021, the new administration began reversing that regulation. And while it's not final at this point, they are still moving toward reversing it. That's unfortunate in that LNG by rail could present, as Lauren was talking about, the different sorts of intermodal transportation. It could be the last mile of transport of LNG to get it to the user or the consumer from the end of a gas pipeline. Because building pipelines is so difficult, we find ourselves with various points in the United States where we have the termination of a gas line, but then no easy way to get gas from that point to a user further up. And one of the bottlenecks for LNG, frankly, or for gas pipelines, is the state of New York won't allow a pipeline to be built across the state. So New England ends up importing gas, even though the country is producing more gas than ever. New England imports gas, some of which actually comes from Russia, because they have no way to get the US gas to New England. So we were looking at different modes of transportation that would help move gas more efficiently across the country. And so trying to do the regulating that would allow those things to happen, I think, is very important. I think on a long-term basis, we will probably see LNG move by rail more efficiently. It moves in just very small quantities under waivers in the United States now. But it's the sort of policy decision that, frankly, should be prioritized and looked at in terms of where do we need those last mile intermodal efficiencies.
Great. Okay. Thanks. That's helpful. All right. We're about to wrap up. This has been a great discussion. I really appreciate both of you joining us today. Laura, why don't I turn to you just for any last comments, highlights, things we should be looking out for as this whole issue progresses?
Oh, thanks, Jeff. I think that this is a very exciting time for energy and transportation, how we think about how freight moves. I think that I would urge everyone to sort of keep an eye on the global supply chains on those critical minerals. When you see, the Secretary of State, visiting the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or other nations in Africa, where you see DRC officials there. Maybe it's in Johannesburg, where he was a few months ago, or we have the Secretary of Commerce or the Deputy Secretary of Commerce there. I mean, what they're trying to do is secure U.S. supply chains for the critical minerals that the Democratic Republic of the Congo is, fabulously wealthy in. Same thing in Latin America, in Australia, and other parts of the world where, because of our system of mining, it's going to be tough. But that geopolitical maneuvering, that diplomacy, is going to be really important. So that's it's sort of a benchmark. That's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is our permitting here locally in the U.S. and also the power grid. How are we doing upgrading the resiliency of the U.S. power grid to be able to provide more power, more dependably, along with decarbonization.
Great, thank you. All
Absolutely.
right, Drew, you get the last word.
Well, lots of things to watch. It is an exciting time, whether it's biodiesel, whether it's electricity, whether it's sustainable aviation fuel, renewable diesel, propane, ethanol. I'm a farm girl, so I like ethanol. But whatever it is, it's new technology that is coming online quickly, and we're seeing efficiencies in all of those areas. But we do need to look in particular at the grid. Do we have the power grid that we need to transmit that electricity and to have it available in all the places it needs to be available? Americans often don't understand where the power comes from when they plug anything in, whatever it might be. And they don't know what to do when there isn't a plug. And so that's, and in Alaska, we don't have as many plugs as in the lower 48, I can tell you. So looking at what is needed to make some of these systems work is very important, very exciting, but lots of policy questions and a dialogue that needs to be happening like this dialogue today. I think these are very important because we need more dialogue and more understanding of what's going to need to happen to allow us to move to this, to have this green transition.
All right, well, that's a great way to end it because the dialogue is important. That's something that we try to do at ConservAmerica, and having experts like both of you participate with us really helps to make that happen. So I want to thank both of you. We'll look forward to staying in touch and maybe doing a repeat of one of these as technology and regulation policy progresses. So thanks, and everyone have a great day. Thank you all for listening.
And happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Holidays.
Take care.